Well, thank you all for attending our event this evening on the dignity of society, Catholic social teaching and natural law. My name is Scott Roniger. I'm the editor of this book on the dignity of society, Catholic social teaching and natural law, written by Russell Hittinger. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, where I also direct the Lonergan Center for Catholic Thought. I'm not a Lonerganian, but I direct the Lonergan Center. That should be clarified. IHE, the Institute for Human Ecology, which is hosting this event, is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the conditions conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing faculty from across the university, the country, and the world here to Catholic University to think about these questions and issues that pertain to all of us. The IHE is proud to co-sponsor this event with the Los Angeles Lonergan Center. The Lonergan Center was founded in 1995 by Catholic scholars at Loyola Marymount University with the aim of preserving the Catholic and Jesuit intellectual tradition. In its current iteration, the mission of the Los Angeles Lonergan Center is the study and teaching of the fullness of the Catholic intellectual tradition. It fulfills this mission, first, by contributing to the intellectual life of LMU through classes and reading groups and dinner discussions. Second, by promoting scholarship in the Catholic tradition, especially in philosophy and theology, through conferences and faculty colloquia that lead to scholarly publications. In fact, tomorrow and Friday, we're going to have a colloquium with a group of scholars who are writing essays in response to Hittinger's book that will eventually be published in the journal Nova et Vetera, and that's being co-sponsored by both IHE and the Lonergan Center. And third, the center serves the greater Los Angeles area through a cultural forum and an executive grade books program. It is a joy for me to introduce my teacher, mentor, friend, and colleague, and sometimes partner in crime, Russ Hittinger. Russ has asked me to give a little bit of a somewhat more substantial intro because I'm going to talk a bit about the cover art. So after I go through an introduction of Russ, I'll go talk a bit about the painting on the cover. In order to provide something of a doorway into Hittinger's thought, and thereby into the book that we're celebrating tonight, I'd like to begin with two texts from St. Thomas, one of Hittinger's most important sources. In the so-called Treatise on Law, Aquinas says, quote, "For every law aims at establishing the friendship either of men with one another or of man with God, and so the whole of the law is fulfilled in the single commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself," end quote. In his commentary on the fifth psalm, Aquinas highlights the fullness of joy of the saints in the fatherland and says that their joy is fully perfect and perfectly full because of, quote, "the society they enjoy, since man by himself is not able to rejoice well in anything, but only when he has friends with him as participants in his good," end quote. The nature, dignity, and joy of society, as well as the laws that promote it and the love of friendship that bonds its members together, have been among the main subjects of Hittinger's extraordinary career, many of the fruits of which we find in his latest book, fittingly entitled On the Dignity of Society. Hittinger has been the leading scholar of Catholic social doctrine and natural law theory for some time now, in part because his approach to these topics integrates historical, philosophical, and theological insights. Hittinger's own work, is a historically important body of work in Catholic political thought rooted in natural law theory and Thomistic philosophy, but also animated by his study of Saint Augustine and thus consistently sensitive to historical contexts and arenas for moral and theological disputation. In his career, Hittinger has written over 100 scholarly articles, published 4 books, a couple more in the works. His publications have been translated into multiple languages, including Italian, French, and Polish. He has given more invited lectures than I care to count, including just about every major lecture for any and every major Catholic institute of higher learning. For some time, he was one of only 2 lay people in the world on not one but 2 pontifical academies, the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. He's won multiple awards for his scholarly excellence, including the Pontifical Medal Deus Scintiorum Dominus from Pope Benedict XVI, an honorary doctorate from the Dominican School of Theology and Philosophy in Berkeley, the Veritas Medal from the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal, the Pius XI Medal from the Society of Catholic Social Scientists, the Cardinal Wright Medal from the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, the Aquinas Medal from the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Maritime Association. He has taught at Christendom College, Fordham University, Princeton University, New York University, the Catholic University of America. He held the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa for roughly 25 years. He's been a visiting scholar, and he's taught at the University of Chicago in their law school and their Committee on Social Thought. He was a visiting professor at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, where he has also served for over a decade as the Dean of the College of Fellows. He has led many summer seminars for the Tertio Millennio program, the Lumen Christi Institute, where he is a senior fellow, and he now serves as executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at the Catholic University of America, where he also holds a research professorship in the School of Philosophy. Now, with that, Russell, as I said, has asked me to say a few words about the cover of the book, which you can see. In the painting we chose for it, and I can say a lot of thought and conversation went into the selection of the painting. It's Vincent van Gogh's 1888 Café Terrace at Night. So, why this painting for this book? 3 reasons. The first, and I think hopefully most obvious, is that it's beautiful, right? And so, beauty is something like the radiation of the true good, and so it's beautiful, and in that sense it's fitting. It's also, in a second sense, fitting because of its historical setting. It's painted in 1888, and of course Rerum Novarum is published in 1891, so we're right around the beginning of the modern tradition of Catholic social teaching. So there's a historical fittingness. But third and most important, there's a deep theological and social significance to the painting. If you look carefully, then you'll notice that the cafe scene is in fact a depiction of the Last Supper. There is Jesus Christ in the middle, in the white garment, serving. The white garment perhaps suggesting a kind of burial shroud. There are 12 figures around Jesus in the cafe, the apostles, and some have suggested that these apostles may be, let's call them women of the night, so that Jesus is calling sinners to repentance and serving them. If you notice, there are many crosses in the painting, especially if you look at the way it was structured, including a very prominent cross in the window behind Christ. So we have a Eucharistic sacrifice depicted in relation to Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, the Last Supper as an anticipation of the crucifixion. And then there is the shadowy figure you can see leaving the supper, going into the building. It's Judas. And Jesus, of course, lets him leave. Some have even suggested that the figure, the kind of menacing figure you see coming down the alley towards the scene, some have suggested it might be Satan. I'm not as sure about that one, but it's been suggested. And you'll also notice that there are 2 major sources of light in the painting: the stars in the sky and Jesus, or nature and grace. Those sources of light flood into the city. The intelligibility of nature and the sacramental presence of Christ radiate the truth into society. As Pope Benedict XVI said when speaking of our encounter with Christ in the Eucharist, quote, "It is precisely this personal act of encounter with the Lord that develops the social mission which is contained in the Eucharist and desires to break down barriers, not only the barriers between the Lord and us, but also and above all those that separate us from one another." End quote. Thus, the painting shows how the infinitely transcendent God, incarnate in Christ, fecundates social life from within by his presence in the sacraments and the light of his teaching. It gives us an image of how Christ and his church can be a leaven in society without being politically combative or competitive. It shows how we can be in the city without dominating it and taking it over politically. As John Paul II said, quote, "The kingdom of God, being in the world without being of the world, throws light on the order of human society, while the power of grace penetrates that order and gives it life." End quote. By giving us a glimpse of what it means to have a supernatural kingdom that is in but not of this world, the painting perhaps gives us a hint of why the tradition has come to be called Catholic social teaching and not Catholic political doctrine. So for those reasons, we thought it was a beautiful and fitting cover for the book. And with that, I give you Professor Hittinger.
better than my lecture. So, first of all, thanks to my colleagues at IAG for organizing the event. Stephen Higgins, my co-director, our assistants who plan and execute these events, Tony and Nate, Jean-Marie Leo, Bill Saunders, Program on Human Rights, MA. There he is. And of course, my old friend, Scott. Okay, I've entitled this Catholic Social Teaching, Taking Stock. Those of you who have read Georges Bernanos' Diary of a Country Priest might recall the conversation between the younger curé and the older priest. The older priest says, I think over breakfast, maybe. That famous encyclical of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, you can read that without turning a hair, like any instruction for keeping Lent. But when it was published, sonny boy, it was an earthquake. And indeed, there was an earthquake. You know, it was published in full by the New York Times. I think the only other one was Pacem in Terris, was published by the New York Times. Or it was at least maybe abbreviated, but in the New York Times. And as John Paul II recalled, Rerum Novarum gave the teaching mission of the Church a kind of citizenship status. The Catholic tradition finally connecting with social facts on the ground and entering a conversation that concerns everyone, and not merely rehearsing the church-state debate that had dragged on for generations, indeed centuries. Rerum Novarum is elegantly simple and concise, especially compared to the mammoth encyclicals of our time, which are usually 4, 5, 6 times longer than Rerum Novarum. It begins on the theme that Thomas uses for the entire Secunda Pars of the Summa. That is the quotation from Damascene, made unto the image and likeness of God. The human agent is provident both for himself and for others. That's the anthropological premise. To work is human action, dignified and moral. His first point. Second point, to acquire property as one's own is a necessary condition for such action. Working is not merely about acquiring, but having something to give to others. That the worker is provident for his family, which is the first bond. Then there's a section that's still read pretty carefully today. He defends the right to form associations other than marriage, church, and state. And the role of political authority is to protect social bodies according to justice and law. And he ends with a defense of collective bargaining, I think what we would call collective bargaining. But note right here, almost nothing to say about the state. Go back and read it. The state only surfaces as a theme at the very end, connected to his disquisition on the protection of little societies and collective bargaining. And of course, the Church has had plenty to say about social institutions and practices over the centuries, about the Church and its hierarchy, religious orders and their properties and immunities, marriage, tithing. The list goes on, but I have to introduce dueling, because my first exploration of anything deeper or antecedent than Rerum Novarum I was reading Rerum Novarum 35, 40 years ago, and I said, what happened before Rerum Novarum? And I got the enchiridion of all these encyclicals going back to 17th century, late 17th century. I couldn't believe every fourth or fifth was about dueling, a social practice of some kind or another. And for many centuries, these kinds of teachings were often put in letters that were passed around amongst a certain set of bishops in a particular ecclesiastical region or country. That's why they're passed around and called encyclicals. But here's the interesting thing. It was never until 1931 officially denominated as Doctrina Socialis. That will happen with Pius XI, Leo's student, 1931, Quadragesimo Anno, where he says, we have inherited Doctrina Socialis. Prior to that, the usual Roman term was Doctrina Civilis, political. No shame in just translating that as political. It included, of course, all of the various social orders, but from the standpoint of government, both temporal and ecclesial, or what we call church and state. And if you'll bear with me, I want to give a brief reflection on these two different adjectives, civil and social, and where Leo really marks the transition from the civil to the social. Until the late 18th century, social life was relatively uncontested. That is to say, in comparison to our culture wars, nothing like that. Take, for example, marriage. With the exception of various Gnostic groups like Albigensians in the Middle Ages, no one seriously challenged the social predicates. One man, one woman, free of impediments, who make religiously recognizable vows and are entitled to raise a family. We did not disagree with Protestants on that definition. It was over the jurisdiction of sacrament. So let me move along. Until the 19th century, or really the late 19th century from a pontifical point of view, what was contested was jurisdiction. Of course, by the 12th century, and certainly into the 13th century, both political societies, civil and ecclesiastical, had recovered Roman law and Greek philosophy. And from those points of view, the proper adjective is civilis, because polity is the most perfect, complete, and comprehensive temporal society. But so too for economic corporations, educational institutions, exploration, colonization of the New World, and so forth. The debates, the contests, have to be seen chiefly in terms of the jurisdiction of the two great ruling authorities. Church is civil, as it's governed by law as well. Indeed, all of the sacraments are governed by law. And for 1,000 years, you have to remember, the papacy governed states that were civil. There were two constitutions. Okay. It was not unusual into the 19th century for high-ranking clerics to have two law degrees. A civil law degree because they had to govern the states, the papal states, as well as canonical, although there was no code until the 1920s. But canon law existed before the code. In fact, it took a lot of work to do canon law once upon a time when you didn't have something as handy as a code. Plus, they had diplomatic training, these high-ranking clerics. With only a few exceptions, for example, Cardinal Bellarmine, the ecclesiastical approach to political affairs was on-the-ground practical. It was learned by sons in their noble families, perhaps with only a bit of philosophy learned in preparation for ordination. But, no doubt, the curia that evolved over those centuries, high-ranking prelates often had considerable skills in matters political. And even by the late 16th century, they still had good reasons to, they found good reasons to use the adjective social. Yet even during the 16th and 17th century missions in the New World, when Jesuit and Dominican missionaries seriously studied the customs and institutions of the naturales. In fact, I think it was the chiefly Jesuit and Dominican missionaries who began the social sciences. They wanted scientific evidence on the ground of what the customs actually meant, who marries whom, how they divide land, the whole bit. But all of the debates were jurisdictional. So, to mention a few, connected with the Europe of the Tridentine era and the missions in the New World, popes vis-a-vis kings, and it was the kings who had the ships and the troops. Between kings themselves, thinking of Portugal versus Spain, between civil authorities and religious orders. They reverted to the jurisdictional issue. What changed? What were the new things in Rerum Novarum? I think it's good to remember that Leo was born in 1810, before the demise of Napoleon, and didn't die until 1903. So he covers the 19th century. And in the 19th century, post-French Revolution, social orders drew the attention of statesmen, prelates, lawyers, social scientists. Social science was invented in the 19th century because they saw that the problem was not just jurisdiction. Of course, there were very powerful state-making regimes in the 19th century, in German lands. But the main problem in German lands, and that's on the record, you don't have to read deeply into history to find people talking about this, was not state-making itself. It was 70% of the population in one generation went from rural to urban. Those were social problems, a multitude of social problems. The interior of every continent on Earth had been penetrated by railroads. Local economies now shipped to ports, to international shipping. Economies of scale were being destroyed worldwide. That's the social problem. It's not just a jurisdictional problem. But I think what really began the move in the Roman mind, and Leo really is an inheritor of the Roman mind, is the loss of the papal states. Remember, they were first lost when Leo was born. Napoleon took them away. But then decisively under the Italian Risorgimento, when Leo was at his prime as Archbishop of Perugia. Listen, to be deprived of statehood in the strictly civil sense of the term is nothing more or less than being deprived of jurisdictional authority. It was a real blow. By the way, it was an important blow in which I think only the hand of God Almighty could have pulled off to get the Catholic mind thinking about society and not just the jurisdictional disputes. They no longer have the states. And by mid-19th century, when Leo is really of age, the Catholic Church, or Catholics, were producing all kinds of social theorists who used the word social, the adjective. Taparelli, Rosmini. My favorite is probably Louis de Bonald, who published in 1801 a book under the title On the Bourse. And this little philosophical and legal brief contributed to the suppression of the law of divorce in 1816 until the Third Republic tried to reinstitute it in 1884. But Bonald's argument is clear. We have to find out what the social bonds are and what they mean. The whole issue pivots, and here I quote, on the unity of union in the multiplicity of unions. We've got to get down to that level. We have to name them and understand them. Bishop von Kettler, Emanuel von Kettler of Mainz, gave the famous Advent sermons of 1848 in the cathedral. Leo, to the end of his life, insisted that von Kettler was the originator of what he was teaching. But it was social. It was not just jurisdictional. In any case, Leo XIII, at around the same time as von Kettler gave his Mainz sermons, created the Academy of St. Thomas, the Perusian Academy of St. Thomas. And when he became Pope, he moved the Academy and its faculty to Rome, where it still lives. The main question, what is society? Or what are societies? And are they more like a community or more like an association? If I had to take an oral exam, I had to describe 19th century social thinking, that's the question that keeps on cropping up. It's not whether they are societies, but are they chiefly societies of contract and cooperation, or are they societies that have very strong bonds? Okay. So, 1878, Leo is a prisoner in the Vatican. There are no more papal states. And the territory of the Vatican itself could hardly be called civil. It will win that eventually, after a long struggle. It becomes recognized as real property, as real territory. And he has lots of time on his hands, and he brought his Academy of St. Thomas to the Vatican, and they begin writing. And you know, one of the first things to be written was Aeterni Patris, on the value of scholastic thinking, and I'm thinking here chiefly about social matters. Okay, on that note, he made a beeline for St. Thomas. And as St. Thomas put it, the Suprema Secundae, question 26, article 8, we should measure the love of different persons according to the different kinds of union, so that a man is more loved in matters touching that particular union in respect of which he is loved. And again, in comparing love to love, we should compare one union with another. I wish J.D. Vance had that quote at his fingertips. It gives a different impression. And so there's 4 questions that flow out of this. Who belongs to whom? Question number 1. I remember in high school in the early 1960s, that's all we thought about. Who belongs to whom? Who's wearing his ring? In fact, Beatles songs for 5 years, every song is about this. Who belongs to whom? Second question, what is the bond, or we would say in scholastic terms, the form of the union? Okay. Third, finality. For what end or ends? The form finalized. And finally, what do these members actually owe to one another? By the way, I've read fairly extensively. I don't find evidence that Leo ever read a social scientist, even though he was doing this in the heyday, the golden age of social science. They mention Marx now and then pejoratively, but so the adjective socialis has to modify a bond, a principle of unity. And here we have three options that come directly out of Aristotle. One bond, a very important one, is substance. Naturally, the greatest bond is soul to body. The precedence and importance of form organizing matter. That is the human person. It's the microcosm of all orders having union. At the other extreme is what Thomas calls a unity of composition. We're like two piles of sand in my driveway that I'm going to make a sandbox for the kids. But I have two. I can say, this one, I pick one out rather than that one. But of course, the pile of sand has no intrinsic union. At the other extreme, one more too. I have to talk about intersubjectivity, which is kind of like a pile of sand, but much more important. If you go to a piazza in Rome and there are 2,000 people, there's a crowd. No one intends a society, a social form. But it is social by virtue of intersubjectivity. Like a line waiting for the subway. It's not mere composition, but it's not fully deserving the adjective social. Not fully. By the way, the work to read on this issue about intersubjectivity being inadequate for describing social unions of all sorts is Wojtyła's essay, I think it's 68. It's called The Person, Subject, and Community. There's a long section in there why intersubjectivity is presupposed for social unions, but in and of itself is not a society. Finally, there is what Aristotle and Thomas call unity of order. That is, individuals share in, by action, a common end and a common form by which they are to achieve it, marriage being the first one. It's called form of order, includes a way of life. And in these social entities, one lives. By the way, this could also be motorcycle clubs. But put that to one side for a moment. But it's not mere intersubjectivity. Okay. So, I think Leo is the first. He didn't invent the idea, but he's the first to express it in a pontifical document. When we talk about a real society, that is a unity of order in which the members share by action in a common end through a common form, the common form is the bond, that there are three necessary ones: matrimony, family, polity, and church. And what he means, Pius XI writes on this later. He got it from Leo, who got it somewhere out of Aquinas. First meaning of necessity is simply neediness. So we need something, and we shouldn't discount need here. So, marriage and family, that union of man and woman, and parents with children, which is a different union, obviously, meets necessity regarding human life and the precarity of human life. Civil society, or let's say political society, meets a need of justice beyond our first cousins. And if you live where I live, very close to Newark, New Jersey, first cousins are no good at this either. Okay. That is real precarity. Justice beyond the immediate family. And the church meets the greatest precarity, forgiveness of sins. You can't do it to yourself. Now, in addition to this, there are many societies that they called arbitrary societies, which meant voluntary. Sports teams, corporations of all sorts, and I say even motorcycle clubs, the Knights of Columbus, labor unions. But not like those first three. So, where am I going with this? That in Rerum Novarum, when he digs into this, he's now doing social doctrine. The political is there. It's one of the necessary societies, but Leo's trying to explain how they relate to one another, qua being social entities. I mean, the family, for example, needs both civil and ecclesial law. It needs it. So these societies not only meet certain kinds of human needs, but they need one another. And so necessity has a second meaning. Necessity as excellence, not just neediness. Because if you get things right in action with other people, man and wife, parents, children, siblings with one another, just keep going. If you get this right, there's an excellence, a virtue, and of human thriving. So, Leo never changed Doctrina Civilis to Socialis, but he performatively did it in Rerum Novarum and in subsequent encyclicals. And that's where Pius XI learned it from, because he was one of Leo's best students. And I say this is a great leap forward. That is, to think of societies, including many social unions, to distinguish social unions from one another, those which are arbitrary, those which are necessary. It's a great leap forward, because the jurisdictional is not made the first point. We worry about jurisdiction only when we have sort of implicitly these three societies and the arbitrary societies surrounding them, and have provided for what's called the Great Coherency. That's in one of the Vatican documents from about 30 years ago in describing this, the Great Coherency. So get this. 6 popes were of the Leonine era. They either came of age and knew Leo, or they were born during Leo's pontificate. Pius X, born 1835, Benedict XV, 1854, Pius XI, 1857, Pius XII, 1876. He was ordained in the Jubilee of 1900. John the 23rd, Paul the 6th. I mean, I don't think there's any time in church history in which you have so many high-ranking prelates who knew one another, and the hub was Leo, a pope. So, all of them were capable of explicating what is the bond, for what end or ends, what do the members owe one another, to distinguish arbitrary societies in which membership can be of many kinds. It extricates the Catholic mind from the older church-state roundabout. They're dealing now with social dislocation, international collapse of economies, not merely church-state problems, nor were the ideologies of the left or the right. Okay, one final remark, and then I'm going to make some remarks about contemporary. One reason I think Leo and his team never bit on the adjective socialis to describe this whole project was Walter Rauschenbusch. The social gospel. From Rochester, New York, born into a German Baptist family, 1861. His father taught at Rochester Theological Seminary's German department. Rauschenbusch himself worked in Hell's Kitchen. But the Rauschenbusch understanding of the social gospel, that is, not forgiveness of sins or the attainment of heaven, but being good members of society. And there was no way Leo was going to use social in that context. He could have, but I mean, they knew what they're up against because social gospel movement in Germany, France, and Italy was quite profound and energetic. So I say it's a great move forward. It doesn't happen overnight. That they put jurisdiction in its proper place. They don't get rid of jurisdiction. All marriage issues can come down to what is the court of first instance in a way. But, okay, there's evidence of problem, and I'm going to use one word to describe it, giganticism. Man, they are now dealing, by the time of Leo's death in 1903, with international trade, interlaced economies, then on to wars and Cold Wars, complex dependencies of northern and southern hemispheres. Now, polities are always more easily identified than the plurality of social unions, because you need a flag. You need a geographically delimited topography and a declaration or a constitution, and you're off and running. Of course, states are also related to a plurality of other social forms regarding religion, ethnicity, education, work, and so on. But it's not so easy to clearly distinguish, certainly not at a global level, the nature of the bonds and the exigencies in which the adjective social is modifying a noun. The scale and complexity of looking at the world, let's say, post-1918, anyway, and speaking of building a better world socially, what do you have to know to build that thing? You have to know more than who has the flag and where is the geography. So, canaries in the coal mine. Two very experienced, well-trained, intellectually well-trained popes, Pius XII and Paul VI, both of whom, having issued an initial social encyclical, stopped writing them. Canaries in the coal mine. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure, why did they stop? Because they were both great thinkers. Yeah, really, Vatican Diplomatic Corps, all the degrees. Now, for Pius XII, ordained a priest when Leo was still alive, probably the most experienced and well-educated curialist took the church, by the way, served just under Pius XI. Pius XII issued a social encyclical, 1939, about a month after the Nazi invasion of Poland, Summi Pontificatus. It's relatively short, principled, really a good read in all sorts of ways. He never wrote another one. And by the way, he's Pope until 1958, which is a long time. And he is a smart guy and has lots of things to say. 20 years silence. Instead of issuing encyclicals on Catholic social teaching, he gave short speeches, 2 radio addresses, and little addresses to pilgrims visiting Rome. His most famous one is on what is the social role of midwives, in which he just plumbs to the depths this kind of ontology. But they could have been given in 15 minutes, maybe 20. And so my diagnosis of this is that post-1945, as the war is over, but everyone's convulsed about other things now. All these new nations come into being. They go out of being very quickly. And I remember, because I used to collect stamps. Those very years, I had to change my stamp book collection every year. What happened to that country? It was in the last book. They came and went. There were civil wars. Decolonization was a big deal. Who belongs to whom? And I think he simply looked at the situation and said to himself, I'll give some short speeches, but I'm not going to give the comprehensive view of what's going on right now. Now, Paul VI, maybe the second smartest and most experienced curialist of that era, born in 1897, Leo is still Pope, served as Secretary of State in the turbulent 20s until 1954. His father was a leader of Catholic social action. He issued one and stopped. Populorum Progressio. It's on the theme of development. And I remember the era, 2 or 3 years afterwards, because the Kiss of Peace had been introduced into our liturgy, and people would turn to each other and say, "May the development be with you." Yeah. He never wrote another one, unless one counts Humanae Vitae is in that genre. And he never wrote another one because he knew the Populorum was not well received. By the way, it's the first social encyclical. It never mentions Thomas, almost no scholastics. But what hurt most, the loudest cry against Populorum Progressio, were the liberation theologians, because they claimed it was unintentionally using dependency theory. That is, development is the global north and all of its resources in banks and organizations feeding money into the global south without understanding the consequences. So, in 1971, I hope you don't mind me just prattling on with some of these stories because you don't get the sense of the problem without knowing some of the history. Well, it's the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. And having been stung by the bad reception of Popolorum, he writes a letter to the president of the Pontifical Commission for Justice and Peace, which had been created right after Vatican II, on why he did not write on the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, quote, "In the face of such widely varying situations, it's difficult for us to utter a unified message and to put forward a solution which has universal validity. Such is not our ambition, nor is it our mission. It's up to Christian communities to analyze with objectivity the situation which is proper to their own country, to shed on it the light of the gospel's unalterable words, and to draw principles of reflection, norms of judgment, and directives for action for the social teaching of the church." He actually tells us why he stopped. That once you get into that fluid world in which social is the adjective, you better press down and be patient to say what's true even, but much less to give a message. Now, two Jesuits, I'm sure some of you have read their book, that was Calvez and Perrin, warned in a book that was published about 58. So at the end of Pius XII's pontificate, it's still a good book. Once upon a time, it was the only book that serious Catholic scholars read to try to see the arc, the historical and philosophical arc of Catholic social teaching. And they warned that without a precisely articulated objective norm, social teaching is a mere bundle of social aspirations analogous to so many other social systems which may be well-intentioned but which lack precision and strength. The warning was clear. Everyone ignored it. So we need less exhortation plus quasi-policy than we need analysis and explication, beginning with facts on the ground. Now, I'm skipping a section on John Paul II's worry about this, because that would take another history to go through. But, the Synod on the Americas, which ended in 1997, he wrote the Apostolic Exhortation. I think it would be called for that. And he said, it would be very useful to have a compendium or approved synthesis of Catholic social doctrine, including a catechism which would show the connection between it and the new evangelization. He wanted something small. He knew it was out of control because he just listened to the Americas, North and South, for 2 years in Rome, tried to formulate what was on their mind, and they couldn't do it very well. And that's what got turned into the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine. There's no argument in it, no philosophical synthesis, actually no historical narrative. You could read the compendium backwards with very little loss of meaning. It's a completely flat scheme. There are about 800 words touching in some way on the issue of water, including the Kyoto Third World Water Treaty. By contrast, even though the word justice appears often in the text, there are only about 500 words specifically on what justice is. I'll take one passage. A large part of the Church's social teaching is solicited and determined by important social questions to which social justice is the proper answer. But of course, every mode of justice is social, right? Commutation social, distribution is social. We don't know who owes what to whom. I would defy a student, unless they already heard my lecture or something else, to come up with. Now, by the way, before I conclude, the catechism is much better, much clearer, but you have to read in 4 different parts of the catechism to pull these things together. It's not in one section. But the best of all is the little book. You can read it in one sitting, Christian Social Teaching, written by Cardinal Hoffner of Cologne. You can get it online in English. It's crystal clear, definitions, how they hang together. Now, yeah, it's appropriate this week that I not read everything I have to say about Fratelli Tutti. Actually, it's not addressed to the Church. It may be the first encyclical ever, just it's not addressed to the Church. And the subtitle in Italian is L'amicizia sociale. What friendships aren't social? But anyway, here is a definition. Solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, is a way of making history. Nothing about what a bond is, or why solidarity, like a labor union, is different than solidarity of something else. The word family denotes a real family 8 times. It's used metaphorically of other things 27 times. Everything is gigantic. And no, there's almost no precision. The encyclical calls marriage family society a local society rather than a particular society. And I think there's a huge difference between saying local and particular. Particular includes the notion of a bond, that is its own bond. I mean, local includes shopping malls. All kinds of things can be local without any social precision. So, here's how I end this. For the sake of you guys being able to get home and just not prattling on forever. We need experience, induction, analysis, reaching principles, being applied to varying aspects of and forms of the word social. In fact, some good social science wouldn't hurt here. And I'll give one example of good social science, what I take to be useful social science. The Nobel Prize winning economists did both of them? It's Case and Deaton wrote a report after a long study, social science study, on morbidity and mortality and how it correlates to marriage, family, civic union, and religion among middle-aged men. for the most part. Middle-aged men are dying like flies. So they found 3 main causes. Listen, there may be 5. And by the way, this is social science work, so it's correlations. This is not Aristotelian analysis, but it's very interesting. The 3 markers of males, maybe mid-30s, who just aren't thriving in life and get sick and die early. The first is this. They can't stand the family. Divorce is rampant. They may live at home, but you're going to find them watching television at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The second one is that they despise civic authority. Starting with the mayor, going to the governor, the president, the Senate, just despise it. Not for them. And the third, which is really interesting, the steepest drop in the practice of religion in the United States are not millennials or Generation Z. It's these guys. Plummeting levels of religious participation. Even what I would call, in American terms, fairly weak religion. No, none of it. Well, you know what those 3 correlations amount to? Are the 3 necessary societies that Leo talks about. Good social science can, by the way, if it contradicts or makes our own philosophical theories more difficult to formulate, so much the better. Better than the abstract generalizations. So, I have a concluding sentence. The truth about social unions cannot be found unless those adjectives have proper nouns. And it may take a lot of work to get there. It's very true that social is profound for us. It's more profound than jurisdiction in many ways. But it's not one thing. Social is not one thing. Once you connect the adjectives to different nouns. So, the nouns should begin with the ones that seem to suggest or have the most dignity, which means also the most necessity in a certain way. And thus, this book. Catholic social doctrine should be read and discussed. It changes different eras of history, but don't read it on your knees. I will never read it on your knees. Read it up here. It is teaching, but it has to first be here. Well, I didn't give my lecture on my knees either. Thank you.
So thanks very much. I have a question. Push you on. I well know only one social and cyclical. Thank you. When you give me one of these, I feel like I should do one of these lounge singing. No. The relationship of technology and the emergence of Catholic social teaching, because you have the encyclical is kind of the child of the technology of the pamphlet. It comes in a little bit later than our most famous pamphlet, Common Sense. So it's about that time. And then you get the new technology that allows them to print them up for pennies in the back of the church. And that's Leo is the pamphleteer, 90 encyclicals. But perhaps, and I want to suggest this, that Pius thought he was introducing the new encyclical when he did the famous radio address at Christmas, that now it's free and it's all over the world. And he's able to get into everyone's home, and you had the fireside chats of FDR, and that he was putting up the flagpole, the new encyclical, which was going to be the worldwide radio address. Do you think there's any truth in that? Because it has entered into the canon of, and has almost the equivalent status of an encyclical.
Well, I include at least the two major radio addresses during the war as part of his move to little things. I mean, compared to Rerum Novarum or something like that. And, but I do think the technology is important. But, when we don't have the word social properly connected to things that are social and differ from one another, then social means this.
Famous one is the radio address at Christmas, because it's the equivalent of Pius VII's Christmas homily, reconciling the Catholics to Napoleonic republics. I mean, for democratic government. So I think he knows what he's doing by having it at Christmas.
And of course, he in the second one, radio address, he warned that the biggest problem, he didn't use the word giganticism, but he used the term, it's too big. We've got to think smaller, by which I don't think he meant that, like, the United States should be smaller than it is or something like that, or the family should be smaller. But we have to get to the nub of what a social union could be and give different examples of them, which is what I think he did for the rest of his pontificate in those short speeches. Yeah. Paul VI tried and actually tells us why he stopped. It was getting too big and didn't have very much to say. At a certain point, didn't have very much to say. Didn't have precision. Yeah. How JP2 managed to write so many, and some of them very long, and not completely lose it, is kind of a miracle of grace. But some of his best encyclicals in the 90s are really big. Evangelium Vitae. But it's very coherent, and it's not just about jurisdiction at all. I mean, he's getting right down to the nub of things. But, as he got older, he wasn't doing it as well anymore. But who does anything better when they're older at that point? So, yes, Michael.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out what the farther along drift of these remarks are. So one thought might be that a whole lot of people need to work a whole lot harder. So finally, 20 or 50 years from now, we'll have a really precise and super detailed social doctrine that can handle all this complexity. But the other way would be to say, actually, we have to remember that these things require prudence, which can't be reduced to a doctrine. And so instead of trying to figure out to, come up with a 12,000 page super precise compendium, we should just expect people to learn how to manage social problems, but it can't be boiled down to principles.
Right. But not in the absence of principles.
Right.
Well, put that way, I completely agree with you. I mean, listen, if Leo, who was in his mid to late 80s, can write these sharp, crisp encyclicals on social issues, there's no reason why this isn't possible for the rest of us. But, he always drilled toward the principle first and gave some examples and then shut up. You find almost no jurisdictional stuff because he had figured out for decades and decades that this was a trick on the church. And he figured out, he was always very friendly to the Third Republic. He was friendly with Bismarck. He gave them Bismarck the highest medal that can be given to a layperson because he was capable of keeping his cool and resolving situations and not lambasting. No, Leo was very good. The only people that Leo was never able to convince were the French, right? And he really kind of mourned that because he thought they should have been his best audience. It didn't work out that way. He loved the Americans because Americans were, at that time, pretty practical, and they were capable of solving the marriage problem, church-state problem, and the problem of schools. And this is why he loved Archbishop Ireland in the Twin Cities, because they had worked out a way, the American bishops, to have schools. There was a time around the time of the Civil War in which there were more Catholic schools in the state of Ohio than in all of Western Europe. And Leo would go, thumbs up. Way to go. But he didn't write that much on it. He did Aeterni Patris. Resources. Here are your chief resources. But now, this may sound like I'm criticizing just the moderns, but I'm not, because I'm not just saying it's fratelli tutti. I think preceding popes ran into the same problem, but they stopped. I don't know, I probably shouldn't publish that, but I mean, the development of the Catholic, modern development of Catholic understanding of social orders is not absolutely continuous. Some people are better at it than others. Some people know the difference between policy and philosophy, etc. Yeah.
I would love to hear you say a few words about a few further words about the significance of the reintroduction of Thomas Aquinas in Aeterni Patris, and sort of what that need of a reintroduction says about the 19th century up to that point, and really early modern political theory up to that point.
Yeah. And so many Catholic thinkers, clerical and lay, long before Leo became Pope, were accessing Aquinas and others. And this is why he would say all the way to the end that he thought von Kettler was the best. He knew the sweet spot of saying, here's an issue like, is a Catholic League of Boy Scouts a threat to Prussia? And he would get right down to it. And so Leo, I think, had as his model von Kettler, but having instituted the first European Academy of Thomas Aquinas in Perugia, he for 20 years, I think he was teaching himself as well. I mean, he had law degrees, he had all the kinds of degrees and so, but I think the scholastic sources were dribbling in from different directions. They're in Tapparelli. It's just a bunch of Catholic thinkers. And Leo had the good fortune of living the 19th century from the beginning through the end, and had good health, and didn't come into his own until he was almost 70 years old. By which point he was really up to speed on the what parts of Thomas you need to read for the, let's put it, civil plus social. He had good advisors who were pretty sharp on this. Now, Brad Lewis has been working on, how as time goes on, we find Rome more and more speaking of the state as an instrument. As an instrument, not in the absence of it being a society or without a society, but chiefly as an instrument. I think that follows from Leo, but not in a straight line. Because until World War I, virtually all those European countries had modern states, all the managerial stuff, and they knew what they were doing. By the way, they avoided wars for most of the 19th century. There was a Franco-Prussian war that was over in 2 weeks or something. But so those so he understood that, and he understood that in most cases, he hated Italy, of course. He lost sleep over Italy. He didn't lose sleep over the Third Republic because the Italians were stealing his own kind. But so all of these ideas had to put it channeled through these different relations. I think his greatest disappointment was the French. But after a few Coca-Colas, he was up and ready to talk pretty nasty about the Italian government. I don't think he ever recognized, for example, that losing those states and being a prisoner in the Vatican is what was liberating everything. If it crossed his mind, I don't remember ever reading him talking about it. And, his student, Pius XI, negotiated with Mussolini to make sure that the Vatican now was a civil government recognized by nations. And it caused a heap of trouble.
Okay. So my question is about Leo XIII and his view on the jurisdictional question, because he does comment in Immortale Dei about the state's duty towards the true religion. And is there a juridical claim there? Granted that he prioritizes the social question.
Not in Immortale. Remember, it's only his third encyclical. And he has 20-some years to go. That's why you have to be careful citing Immortale, because you don't find him saying those things 10 years later. But my answer, trying to save the situation, is that when he invokes the jurisdictional, he almost always has first and foremost the institution of marriage in mind. And the French government was trying to put into place a law of no-fault divorce, which they had during the Revolution, but Napoleon refused to put into the code. But they wanted no-fault divorce. And that was his main beef about the Italians as well, because they were flirting with the idea of no-fault divorce, but backed off. So for Leo, the jurisdictional comes into view where the church actually does have authentic, how to put it, jurisdictional purchase on something. And that begins with the sacrament of marriage. Because South American countries were even further ahead on this. Laws of divorce and no-fault divorce. And usually when he has his gander up during that period, late 19th century, and does refer to the jurisdictional, it really is something that's under the jurisdiction of the church, if only in part. Because the problem with marriage is also under the jurisdiction of polity. There is a law of divorce or a law of marriage. And so if you factor that in, also despoiling church property. If you put those two things together, he looks less like what people take immortality to be. In fact, there are lines right in that encyclical, which he keeps circling back to the issue of the jurisdiction. It's a sacrament. At least for Catholics, it is. And he appeals to that. It's not just under the jurisdiction of the state. Put that into the equation, and you're not going to get the integralist answer. But that takes reading several encyclicals, right? To see how when he raises a jurisdictional question, what's adjacent to it? You can always count on marriage. He really worried about that one. Properties didn't worry about as much. He lost most of them. Education, dual jurisdiction. The church is a teacher, and it has its own baptized citizens, and the church can legitimately teach. So put marriage in schools, and you get a much different sense of where he's going. I can't see, which is one of the problems.
Just thinking about the possible nouns that can be reclaimed if you want to move social back from adjective to noun, right? In the tradition we have society, but also community, and certainly in Cicero there's much is made of the distinction between the two in Book 1 of On Duties. Also, but bringing in more medieval language, you have the other candidates, corporations, meaning bodies, not companies, and of course orders. And yet, all four of these seem to be used in modern Catholic social doctrine. Do you think we should focus on reclaiming just the noun itself, that we have to move from social as an adjective primarily, or does the distinction among those four terms matter? Is that a fight worth having?
It's a fight worth having if the fight leads to discovering what is the truth about those matters. So I belong to a condo association right across the river from New York City. And it is a kind of body, social body. We all belong to it. All of the owners belong to it. There are regular meetings. We actually agreed to rules to live by with regard to our properties in the same building. Well, something's happening there that has crossed the threshold into some kind of corporation or incorporation. So do we even think about things like contract law? Platt says it is. People that do contract law have to sort out what's being contracted. and who has authority to make the contract, and what is the nature of the contract? Is it binding people? Right? So I'll give an example. Years ago, I had to file for a 501c3 in the state of Oklahoma. And you get to paperwork, and the first question is, what is the purpose of your corporation, for profit or not for profit? Simple. I knew what my answer was: not for profit. The purpose is not to make money. Doesn't mean we don't have money for abilities. And the very next question is, religious or not religious? Check, religious. Third question, which is, if you have checked the box religious, you cannot qualify under Oklahoma law if you only have a post office box. You have to have an address, because being a land of thriving Protestantism, they know that half the pastors that have churches, they have P.O. boxes, and they're raising the money to a television. And the thinking here is that there's no church here. There is no religious body going on here. I thought it was pretty shocked. There's a bunch of other questions too. How are you organized? Who has authority for how long? Those are common, those are real types of questions to identify who and what you are, so that the state can understand who you are. You're claiming a tax victim of all the income, and so the state is asking you intelligent questions of who and what you are. And I think if we go into ordinary life, whether you're law firms or businesses or education, for instance, well, we're always alert to these questions of who we are, what we're trying to do, how we're doing it, how we hold ourselves out to others for recognition. So I love the line by JP2, and I think it's in Letter to Families. What is the first thing that wider society owes to marriage and family? The first thing: recognition. To be truly recognized for what you are, and that you are not a condo association. There's something more, something different than the condo. No problem with condo associations. You're not a motorcycle club. I don't know why this isn't a fairly easy task, at least for starters. First of all, you get someone to tell you what they are. Why not start there? The San Jose chapter of the Hells Angels. Here's a starter. Do you do things together? Oh, yes. Is this just a temporary association? Probably not. Anthony Falcone is gesturing to me that the lights are out. Okay. Thank you.